They priced her at $10, and she told him not to waste it. But Caleb Thorne had already made up his mind before the coin ever touched the table, because out here in the dry heat of a frontier town, a man learned to recognize the difference between something cheap and something that only looked that way under bad light. And the woman standing there with dust on her dress and silence in her eyes didn't belong to the kind of trade happening in front of him, even if everyone else pretended. She did, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low, steady, almost tired. "Don't spend your money on me." Like she was trying to save him from something he couldn't yet see, not pleading, not grateful, just certain, and that certainty settled somewhere deep in his chest like a stone that refused to move. The kind that came from years of watching men make choices they didn't understand until it was too late. And for a moment he just stood there, boots planted in the dirt, sun cutting sharp across the wooden storefronts, the smell of leather and sweat hanging heavy in the still air. And he noticed things no one else seemed to notice, like how she didn't look at the ground the way others did, didn't shrink or bend or perform the quiet obedience that usually came with a price tag. No, she stood straight, even with her wrists loosely bound, like whatever they thought they were selling had never actually been theirs to begin with. And that was when the laughter started, low at first, then louder, a few men leaning back against the railing, hats tipped just enough to watch the show, waiting to see if Caleb would play along, if he'd treat it like a joke the way they all did, because that was easier than asking why a woman like that was standing there in the first place, easier than admitting something about it felt wrong. But Caleb didn't laugh, didn't say a word, just reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against worn bills folded from too many long rides and too many quiet nights, and he pulled out more than he needed, more than anyone expected, and when he set it down on the table, the sound wasn't loud, but it carried, cut through the air in a way that made the laughter stumble and fall short. And still he didn't look at her, not yet, his eyes fixed on the man behind the table. A thin smile stretched across a face that had seen too many deals and forgotten all of them. And the man raised an eyebrow like he wasn't sure if this was boldness or foolishness, maybe both. But money was money out here, and he gathered it up without asking questions. Because questions were the kind of thing that got a man into trouble, and trouble had a way of sticking around longer than it should. And when the rope around her wrists was loosened, she didn't move right away, didn't thank him, didn't even shift her weight. Just stood there like she was waiting for something else to happen, something unseen, something heavier than the exchange that had just taken place. And Caleb finally turned then, just a little, enough to see her from the corner of his eye, enough to notice the way the light caught on something at her neck, a thin silver chain, broken, barely hanging on. And for a second he thought about it, about how things that break don't always make a sound. Sometimes they just stay that way, quiet and unnoticed until someone decides to look closer, and then she stepped forward, slow, deliberate, and as she did, the chain slipped, the small piece of silver falling into the dust between them, and no one else seemed to care, no one else even noticed, but Caleb did, because he'd spent too many miles alone learning that the smallest things often carried the heaviest weight, and he bent down, picked it up without a word, brushing the dirt off with his thumb, and when he held it out to her, their eyes met for the first time, and there it was, not fear, not relief, something steadier, something that made the world feel quieter for just a second, like the wind had stopped to listen, and she took it, fingers barely touching his, and that was when she spoke again, softer this time, almost like a warning meant only for him. "You shouldn't have done that." And he didn't answer, didn't ask why, because somewhere deep down he already knew this wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of something that would follow him past the edge of this town, past the last fence line, into places where choices didn't come cheap and silence carried more truth than words ever could. And as he turned toward his horse, the laughter behind him didn't come back, not the same way, because even they could feel it now. Something had shifted, something small and quiet, like a coin hitting wood, like a chain slipping free, like a man stepping into a story he didn't understand yet, but was already part of whether he liked it or not. The town did not follow them, but its weight did, clinging to Caleb Thorne like dust that would not shake loose. And he felt it in the way the boards creaked under his boots as he crossed the street, in the way the wind seemed to hesitate between the buildings, in the way every eye stayed just a second too long before pretending not to watch, because something had shifted, and men like them always noticed when something they could not explain stepped into their world, and beside him, the woman walked without hurry, without hesitation, her hands now free but held close to her sides, as if freedom itself required time to learn, and she did not ask where they were going, did not question the horse tied to the post, or the worn saddle that had seen more miles than most men in that town. She simply stopped when he stopped, waited when he moved, like she was measuring something invisible, something that had nothing to do with distance or direction, and when he untied the reins and placed his hand lightly against the horse's neck, the animal shifted but did not resist, as if it understood the quiet tension standing between the two humans more clearly than either of them did. And Caleb adjusted the saddle without speaking, his movements steady, deliberate, the kind that came from years of doing the same thing in silence. And when he finally turned toward her, there was a brief pause, not long, but enough to feel, enough to acknowledge that nothing about this was ordinary, and he gestured toward the saddle, not with authority, not with expectation, just a simple motion that left the choice entirely with her. And she looked at it, then at him, then beyond him, toward the edge of town where the land opened into something wider and less certain, and for a moment, it seemed like she might walk away, might take the space that had been given and disappear into it. But instead she stepped forward, slow, careful, placing her hand on the worn leather as if testing whether it would hold her weight, not physically, but in a way that went deeper than balance. And when she climbed up, she did not settle fully, did not relax into the seat. She remained poised, alert, like someone who had learned that stillness did not always mean safety, and Caleb mounted behind her, keeping just enough distance to respect the space she held around herself. And with a light pull on the reins, the horse moved, hooves pressing into the dirt road that led out of town, and no one spoke. Not him, not her, not the men watching from the shadows of the buildings, because words would have been too small for what was happening, too simple for something that carried weight without sound. And as they passed the last row of wooden structures, the air changed, cleaner, wider, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant hills, and Caleb felt his shoulders shift, just slightly, as if leaving the town meant leaving something else behind as well, something tighter, something that did not belong to the open land ahead. And the road stretched out before them, a thin line cutting through miles of dust and silence. And still she did not speak, did not ask his name, did not offer hers. And he did not push, did not fill the quiet with unnecessary words. Because out here, silence was not emptiness. It was language, it was respect, it was the space where truth waited until it was ready to be seen. And after what might have been 10 minutes or 10 miles, time losing its meaning under the steady rhythm of the horse's stride, she shifted slightly, just enough for him to notice, just enough to signal that something was about to break the silence. And when she spoke, her voice was softer than before, but no less certain. "You should turn back." And he did not respond immediately, not because he did not hear her, but because he understood that this was not a suggestion about direction. It was something else, something heavier, something tied to the warning she had given him earlier. And he let the horse continue forward, steady, unhurried, and only after a few more steps did he speak, his voice low, even, carrying none of the tension that might have been expected. "I do not turn back once I start something." And she was quiet again after that, but it was a different kind of quiet, not distant, not guarded in the same way, more like she was considering something, weighing it against whatever she carried inside herself. And the broken silver piece rested in her hand, her fingers tracing its edge without thinking. And Caleb noticed that too, the way she held it not like an object, but like something that mattered, something that connected her to a place or a past that had not been left behind as easily as the town now fading behind them. And the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows that stretched and shifted across the open land, and far ahead, where the road bent slightly toward the hills, a faint movement caught Caleb's eye, not enough to alarm, not enough to change course, just enough to remind him that the world beyond the town was no less watchful, no less full of things that waited to reveal themselves at the right moment. And he did not point it out, did not draw attention to it, because whatever was coming, whatever had already begun the moment he placed that money on the table, would arrive in its own time. And beside him, the woman sat a little straighter, her gaze fixed ahead now, no longer on the ground or the space between them, but on the horizon itself, as if she could already see what he could not. And as the distance between them and the town grew, so did the quiet understanding that neither of them would say out loud, that this road, this simple path of dust and sun, was no longer just a way out. It was a way forward into something neither of them had chosen, but both of them were now part of, whether they were ready or not. The road narrowed as it climbed, not steep, but enough to slow the horse and stretch each step into something heavier, something that made the silence between them feel closer, more present, and the wind shifted too, carrying a different scent now, less dust, more stone, like the land itself was changing its mind about who it allowed to pass. And Caleb noticed the way her posture adjusted with it, subtle but precise. Her shoulders no longer held in that guarded tension from before, but not relaxed either, something in between, like she was listening to the ground through the movement of the horse, reading signs he could not see. And he had known enough people out here to recognize that kind of awareness, the kind that did not come from books or stories, but from years of paying attention to things that did not speak in words. And after a while, he slowed the horse to a stop near a stretch of flat land where a few scattered rocks broke the surface like old bones. And he swung down first, boots hitting the ground with a dull thud that seemed louder than it should have been. And he stepped back, giving her space again, the same way he had in town, the same way he had since the moment he placed the money on the table. And she dismounted without assistance, her movements careful but not uncertain. And for a second they stood there, the two of them, facing the same direction, looking out over the open land that stretched toward the distant hills. And it was the kind of place where a man could disappear if he wanted to, the kind of place where names and pasts did not follow unless you carried them yourself. And Caleb reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a small canteen and a piece of wrapped bread. Nothing special, just enough to get through the next few miles. And he held them out toward her without speaking, and she looked at them, then at him, then back at the land. And when she took them, it was not hesitant, not reluctant, just measured, like everything else she did. And she drank slowly, not like someone who had been deprived, but like someone who understood the value of taking only what was needed. And when she finished, she handed the canteen back, her fingers brushing his again. And this time neither of them pulled away as quickly, just a fraction of a second longer, enough to feel the presence of the other, enough to acknowledge it without turning it into something else. And then she stepped away, moving a few feet toward a cluster of rocks, her gaze fixed on the ground, scanning, searching. And Caleb watched her without asking, without interrupting, because whatever she was doing did not require explanation. And after a moment, she crouched down, her hand brushing against the dirt, and she picked up something small, something he could not see clearly from where he stood. And when she straightened, she held it in her palm, turning it slightly so the light caught it. And Caleb stepped closer, just enough to see a small fragment of stone, smooth, worn, marked with faint lines that did not look like cracks. And she spoke then, her voice quiet but steady. They passed through here. And Caleb glanced around, seeing nothing at first, just the same stretch of land, the same scattered rocks, the same wind moving through dry grass. But then he looked closer, really looked, and he began to notice the signs she had already read, the slight disturbance in the dirt, the way one rock had been shifted just enough to break the pattern, the faint impression of hooves that had not yet been erased by the wind. And he felt something settle in his chest again, that same weight from before, only clearer now, more defined. And he nodded once, not because she needed confirmation, but because he understood what she was telling him without needing more words. And she closed her hand around the stone, holding it like it mattered, like it connected her to whatever had passed through this place before them. And then she looked at him, directly this time, her eyes steady, unguarded in a way they had not been before. And she said, "They will come." And there was no fear in her voice, no urgency, just certainty, the kind that did not ask to be believed. And Caleb considered that, the road behind them, the town now far enough away to feel like a memory, the land ahead that offered no promises. And he let out a slow breath, not heavy, not strained, just enough to mark the moment. And he reached for the reins again, his hands steady as ever. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm it always had. Then we will be here when they do. And she watched him for a second longer, as if measuring those words the same way she measured everything else. And then she gave the smallest nod, not agreement, not acceptance, just acknowledgement. And as they mounted again and the horse began to move forward, the distance between them felt different now. Not smaller, not larger, just changed, like something unseen had shifted into place, something that neither of them had chosen, but both of them had begun to understand. And above them, the sky stretched wide and empty, offering no answers, only space, and somewhere beyond the bend in the road, something waited, not rushing, not hiding, just waiting, the way the land itself always did. The sun had begun its slow descent when the air changed again, not in temperature, not in light, but in something quieter, something that pressed gently against the skin like a question waiting to be answered, and Caleb felt it before he saw anything, the same way he had learned to read a storm long before the first cloud showed itself. And beside him, she straightened slightly, her fingers tightening around the small piece of silver that now rested against her palm, as if it had become more than just something broken, as if it was a thread pulling her toward something only she could sense. And the horse slowed on its own, ears shifting forward, picking up on what neither of them had yet spoken, and Caleb let the reins loosen in his hand, giving the animal space to choose its pace, because sometimes the land knew before the man did, and the road curved gently ahead, dipping between two low ridges that cast long shadows across the path. And it was there, just beyond that bend, that the silence deepened, not empty, but full, like the moment before a word is spoken, and she spoke first, her voice barely above the wind. "Stop here." And he did, without question, without hesitation, because something in her tone carried the kind of certainty that did not ask for permission, and they both dismounted, the ground beneath their boots firm but marked. Faint impressions pressed into the dirt in patterns that would mean nothing to most, but not to her, and she moved forward slowly, her steps careful, her eyes tracing the ground the way a reader traces lines in a book, and Caleb stayed back, watching, not out of distance, but out of respect, because this was her language, not his. And after a few moments, she knelt, brushing her fingers across the surface of the earth, following a line only she could see, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, not fear, not warning, something closer to recognition. "They are close." And Caleb turned his gaze toward the ridges, scanning the horizon, seeing nothing at first, just the fading light stretching across the land. But then he noticed it, a stillness that did not belong to the natural rhythm of the place, a shape that held where the wind should have moved it. And then another, and another, not approaching, not retreating, just present, like the land itself had grown eyes, and he did not reach for anything, did not shift into readiness the way most men would. Because whatever this was, it was not something that could be met with force or fear, and beside him, she rose slowly, turning toward those distant shapes, and for the first time since he had met her, her posture changed completely, no longer guarded, no longer cautious, but grounded, steady, like she had stepped into a place where she belonged, and she took a few steps forward, away from him, away from the horse, and Caleb did not follow, did not call out. Because he understood now that this moment was not his to control, not his to shape, and the wind shifted again, carrying a faint sound, not voices, not footsteps, something softer, something that moved through the air like memory. And the shapes on the ridge became clearer, not threatening, not hidden, just watching. And Caleb stood where he was, the space between them stretching, not in distance, but in meaning, and he realized then that whatever he had done back in that town, whatever choice he had made without fully understanding it, had not been about taking her away from something. It had been about bringing her back to something else, something larger, something older than the lines drawn on maps or the rules spoken in dusty streets. And she stopped a few feet ahead, her back to him, the broken silver now held up in her hand, catching the last light of the sun, and for a moment, nothing moved, not the horse, not the wind, not even the shadows. And then, slowly, one of the figures on the ridge stepped forward, not descending, not approaching, just stepping into clearer view. And Caleb could see now that it was a man, tall, still, his presence carrying the kind of weight that did not need to be announced, and the others remained where they were, silent, unmoving, and the space between them all held something unspoken, something that did not need words to be understood, and she lowered her hand slightly, the silver resting again in her palm, and she did not turn back, did not look at Caleb, but her voice carried to him anyway, steady, certain, "You should not be here." And this time, it was not a warning, not a suggestion, it was a truth spoken without judgment, and Caleb let the words settle, let them find their place inside him, and for a long moment, he said nothing, because there was nothing to argue, nothing to defend, only a choice that had already been made. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried across the space between them. "I am already here." And the words did not challenge, did not demand. They simply existed, the same way he did, the same way the land did. And she stood still for a second longer, and then, just slightly, she nodded, not turning, not facing him, just acknowledging what could no longer be undone. And as the last light dipped below the ridge, the figures remained where they were, not coming closer, not turning away, just watching. And in that stillness, Caleb understood something he had not known before, that some roads did not lead away from danger or toward safety. They led into something deeper, something quieter, something that asked not for strength, but for presence. And standing there between the fading day and the watching silhouettes, he realized that whatever came next would not be decided by who held power, but by who chose to remain. The light faded slowly, not disappearing all at once, but pulling back inch by inch, leaving the land in that quiet space between day and night where everything seemed to hold its breath. And Caleb Thorne did not move, not because he did not feel the weight of the moment, but because he understood that movement, the wrong kind, would mean something he could not take back. And ahead of him, she stood still, her figure outlined against the dimming sky, the broken silver, resting in her hand like a piece of a story that had not yet finished telling itself. And the figures on the ridge remained where they were, silent, watching, not closing the distance, not turning away. And in that stillness, something shifted again, subtle, almost invisible, but real, like the land itself had decided to speak without words. And then it happened, not suddenly, not with force, but with intention. The man at the front of the ridge took another step forward, just one, enough to change the shape of the moment, enough to make it clear that this was no longer just observation. It was acknowledgement, and Caleb felt it settle in his chest, that same quiet understanding that had followed him since the town, that this was not about him, not entirely, but he was part of it now, whether he belonged or not. And she moved then, not back toward him, but forward, closing the space between herself and the unseen line that separated her from those watching figures. And her voice carried across the distance, calm, steady, spoken in a language Caleb did not understand, but did not need to, because tone had its own truth. And whatever she said, it was not fear, it was not apology, it was something else, something that stood on its own. And the man on the ridge listened without interruption, his posture unchanged, his presence as steady as the ground beneath him. And when she finished, the silence returned. But it was different now, not uncertain, not tense, more like a space being held open, waiting for the next piece to fall into place. And Caleb remained where he was, not stepping forward, not calling out, because he knew that if he crossed that invisible line without being asked, he would not just be moving his feet, he would be changing something deeper, something that had not yet been offered to him. And the wind moved lightly through the grass, carrying the faint sound of leather shifting, of quiet breath, of presence without threat. And then, slowly, the man on the ridge raised his hand, not high, not dramatic, just enough to signal something to those behind him. And one by one, the other figures adjusted, not advancing, not retreating, simply shifting their stance, as if a decision had been made without needing to be spoken aloud. And Caleb watched it unfold with the same stillness he had carried all day, his hands relaxed at his sides, his weight balanced, not ready to fight, not ready to flee, just ready to remain. And after a moment, she turned, finally, not fully, just enough for him to see her face in the fading light. And there was something different there now, something that had not been there before, not softness, not relief, something closer to recognition. And she walked back toward him, step by step, unhurried, her gaze steady. And when she reached him, She did not stop right away. She moved past him slightly, enough to place herself between him and the figures on the ridge, not blocking, not shielding, just positioning. And then she spoke, her voice low, meant only for him. "They see you." And Caleb nodded once, not asking what that meant, because he already understood enough, and she continued, after a brief pause, "They do not understand you." And that, too, made sense, more than he expected, more than he was ready to admit, and he let out a slow breath, his eyes still on the ridge, and then he said, quietly, "That makes two of us." And for the first time, the corner of her mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but something close, something that acknowledged the truth in his words without needing to expand on it. And she reached into his hand then, taking the small piece of silver he had given her earlier, and she held it up once more, letting the last trace of light catch its surface, and then she pressed it back into his palm, closing his fingers around it with a gentle but firm motion, and Caleb looked down at it, then back at her, his brow tightening slightly, not in confusion, but in the quiet question he did not voice, and she met his gaze fully now, her eyes clear, steady, and she said, "It does not belong to me anymore." And the words settled between them, heavier than they should have been for something so small. And before he could respond, before he could ask what she meant, she stepped back, turning again toward the ridge, and this time, when she spoke, her voice carried farther, stronger, the same language as before, but with something added to it, something that felt like a bridge being built in real time. And the man on the ridge listened, and after a moment, he inclined his head, just slightly, and that small motion carried more weight than any command, and Caleb felt it then, not relief, not resolution, but a shift, a quiet opening in the air that had been closed before. And as the darkness settled fully over the land, the figures on the ridge remained, but they no longer felt distant in the same way. And Caleb stood there, the small piece of silver now warm in his hand, understanding that whatever this was, whatever path he had stepped onto, it was no longer just about a choice made in a dusty town. It was about something that would unfold slowly, deliberately, in the spaces between words, in the silence that held meaning longer than sound ever could. The night settled in fully, not sudden, not heavy, but complete, the kind of darkness that did not hide things but revealed them in a different way. And Caleb Thorne stood where he was, the small piece of silver resting in his palm, its edges warmed by his hand, its meaning heavier now than when he first picked it up from the dust. And across from him, she remained still for a moment longer after speaking, her voice fading into the open air as if it had become part of the land itself. And then something changed again, not in the figures on the ridge, not in the wind, but in her, in the way her shoulders lowered just slightly, in the way her stance shifted from guarded to grounded, like a weight she had been carrying had been set down without anyone seeing it fall. And the man on the ridge stepped forward once more, not descending fully, but enough to stand clearly in view, his outline steady against the faint starlight beginning to take shape above, and Caleb watched him the same way. He had watched everything since this began, without assumption, without fear, just presence. And then the man spoke, his voice carrying across the distance, calm, measured, in a language Caleb did not understand. But this time, the tone was different, not questioning, not distant, something closer to acknowledgement. And she listened, her head tilting slightly as if catching every detail, every nuance. And when he finished, she responded without hesitation, her voice steady, her words flowing with a quiet strength that did not need to rise in volume to carry meaning. And Caleb felt something shift again, not outside, but inside, like he was standing at the edge of something that was not meant to be explained, only witnessed. And the exchange continued, back and forth, not long, not drawn out, just enough to shape whatever decision was forming between them. And then the man lifted his hand again, this time not as a signal, but as a gesture, something smaller, something more precise. And from the shadows behind him, another figure stepped forward, younger, lighter in frame, carrying something in both hands. And as that figure moved closer to the edge of the ridge, the object became clearer, a strip of cloth, worn but carefully folded. And Caleb felt his breath slow, not from tension, but from recognition that this moment held something he had not yet been given the words to understand. and the younger figure stopped, extending the cloth forward. Without stepping down, and she took a step closer, just enough to receive it, her movements deliberate, respectful, and when the cloth passed from one hand to the other, the space between them seemed to settle, like something unfinished had just been completed, and she unfolded it slightly, revealing markings that caught the faint light, patterns that held meaning far beyond their shape, and for a brief moment, she closed her eyes, not in relief, not in exhaustion, but in acknowledgement, and, when she opened them again, she turned toward Caleb, fully this time, and walked back to him. The cloth now held gently in her hands, and when she reached him, she did not stop immediately. She stepped closer than before, close enough that the space between them no longer felt like distance, but like choice, and she looked at him, not measuring, not questioning, just seeing, and then she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "They will not take me back." And Caleb absorbed the words without reacting, not because they did not matter, but because he understood that this was not a simple statement. It was a shift in everything that had led to this moment. And she continued, after a brief pause. "They asked if I wanted to return, and her gaze did not waver, did not soften. It held steady, carrying the weight of the choice she had made." And Caleb nodded once, slowly, not asking why, not asking what that meant for her, for him, for anything that would come next, because he knew that some answers did not need to be spoken to be understood, and she extended the cloth toward him then, not offering it fully, just enough for him to see, and the patterns etched into it seemed to hold a quiet gravity, something tied to identity, to belonging, to something that could not be traded or taken, and she said, "This was mine before." And then, after a pause that stretched just long enough to matter, "It can be yours now, if you stay." And the words settled into the night air, not heavy, not forced, just present. And Caleb looked at the cloth, then at her, then past her to the ridge where the figures still stood, watching, not with pressure, not with expectation, just with awareness. And he felt the weight of the silver in his hand, the small broken piece that had started this path, and he realized then that nothing about this was an exchange, not the money in the town, not the silence on the road, not the presence here under the open sky. It was something else, something that did not follow the rules he had known, and he closed his fingers around the silver, feeling its edges press into his palm, grounding him in the moment. And when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying the same quiet certainty he had held from the beginning. "I did not come here to take anything." And she watched him for a second, then nodded, not disappointed, not surprised, just acknowledging the truth in what he said. And she lowered the cloth, holding it close once more, and behind her, the figures on the ridge began to shift, not leaving, not disappearing, just stepping back into the darkness from which they had come, one by one, until only the man at the front remained for a moment longer, and he held Caleb's gaze across the distance, not challenging, not welcoming, simply seeing him. And then he, too, stepped back, and the ridge returned to shadow, and the night became still again, but not the same stillness as before. This one carried something new, something that lingered, and as Caleb stood there, the silver still in his hand, the woman beside him no longer between two worlds, but standing firmly in one, he understood that the road ahead had changed, not in direction, not in distance, but in meaning, and whatever came next would not be about where they were going, but about why they had chosen to walk that path together. The night did not end the moment. It deepened it, stretching it across the land like a quiet promise that had not yet decided what it would become. And Caleb Thorne stood beside her without speaking, the silver still resting in his hand, its edges no longer sharp but familiar, like something that had found its place without asking permission. And for a while neither of them moved, not because they did not know what came next, but because they understood that some moments were not meant to be rushed. And the horse shifted slightly behind them, a soft breath breaking the stillness, reminding them both that time, even out here, did not stop. It only slowed, and she turned first, not toward the ridge that had now disappeared into darkness, but toward the open land ahead, her gaze steady, no longer divided, no longer searching for something behind her. And when she spoke, her voice carried a quiet clarity that had not been there before. "You can still leave." And Caleb did not answer right away, not because he needed to think, but because he wanted to feel the weight of those words before placing anything beside them. And he looked out across the land, the faint outline of hills, the long stretch of earth that did not promise safety or certainty, only distance. And then he glanced down at the silver in his hand, the small broken piece that had passed from dust to her hand to his again. And he closed his fingers around it once more, grounding himself in something real, something that had already been decided. And when he spoke, his voice was as steady as it had been since the beginning. I could have left back there. And he nodded slightly toward where the town would be, miles behind them now, but I did not. And that was all he said, because anything more would have been unnecessary. And she watched him for a moment, not measuring, not questioning, just seeing. And then she gave a small nod. Not approval, not agreement, just acknowledgement, the kind that did not need to be explained. And she walked toward the horse, her steps light but certain. And this time when she placed her hand on the saddle, there was no hesitation, no testing, just movement. And Caleb followed, mounting after her, the same distance between them, but it felt different now, not cautious, not guarded, something quieter, something settled. And as the horse began to move again, the rhythm returned, steady, familiar, carrying them forward into the night, and the land seemed to open in a new way, not wider, but clearer, like something had been resolved behind them, leaving only what lay ahead. And for a while, they rode in silence, not the kind that avoided words, but the kind that made them unnecessary. And after a time, she spoke again, her voice softer now, not because it lacked strength, but because it no longer needed to carry distance. My name is Ayanna. And the words hung between them. Simple, but heavier than anything she had said before, because a name was not just sound, it was identity, it was belonging, it was something that could not be taken, only given. And Caleb felt it settle, felt the meaning of it in a way that had nothing to do with language, and he nodded slightly, even though she could not see it from where she sat. And after a moment, he answered, Caleb, not adding anything more, not shaping it into something formal, just offering it the same way she had offered hers. And the exchange did not feel like introduction. It felt like recognition, like two pieces of something aligning without force. And the horse carried them forward, the steady sound of hooves against the earth marking time in a way that words never could. And above them, the sky stretched endless, stars beginning to emerge one by one, quiet, constant. And after a while, Ayanna shifted slightly, her hand resting near the saddle, her fingers brushing against the worn leather, and she said, You do not ask questions. And there was no accusation in her voice, no curiosity either, just observation. And Caleb let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, but close, and he answered, Questions do not always bring answers. And she was quiet after that, considering, and then she said, Sometimes they bring understanding. And Caleb nodded, this time more visibly, and he said, Sometimes. And the word carried no disagreement, only space. And they rode on, the land stretching ahead, the past settling behind them. And after some time, the outline of a small structure appeared in the distance, barely more than a shape against the horizon, but enough to mark a destination. And Caleb guided the horse toward it, his movements steady, familiar. And Ayanna did not ask where they were going, did not question the direction, because something had already shifted between them, something that did not require explanation. And as they approached, the shape became clearer, a simple cabin, weathered by time, standing alone against the open land. And Caleb slowed the horse, bringing it to a stop a few yards away. And for a moment, neither of them dismounted, both of them looking at the place that would now hold whatever came next. And the silence returned, but it was not the same as before. This one carried something new, something that felt less like distance and more like beginning. And Caleb finally spoke, his voice low, steady. It is not much. And Ayanna looked at the cabin, then at the land around it, then up at the sky, and she said, just as quietly, It is enough. And the words settled into the space between them, not as reassurance, not as expectation, but as truth. And as they dismounted and stepped onto the ground, the night held them both in its quiet, the path behind them no longer calling, the one ahead not yet defined. And somewhere between the two, something had begun to take shape, something neither of them had named, but both of them had chosen. The cabin did not welcome them. It simply stood there, weathered with holding years of silence in its grain, the door slightly uneven on its hinges, the small window catching a faint reflection of starlight, and Caleb Thorne stepped forward first, not out of habit, but because movement had always been his way of settling into a place, and he pushed the door open slowly, the sound low and familiar, like something that had been waiting to be used again, and he stepped inside without looking back, trusting that if she chose to follow, it would be because she had decided to, not because he had asked, and Ayanna remained outside for a moment longer, her eyes scanning the land around the cabin, not searching for danger, but acknowledging the space, the distance, the quiet. And then she stepped forward, crossing the threshold without hesitation, and the air inside was cooler, carrying the faint scent of wood and dust, of time spent alone, and Caleb moved through the space with quiet efficiency, lighting a small lantern that cast a soft glow across the room, revealing simple things, a table worn smooth by years of use, a chair slightly uneven, a bed against the far wall with a folded blanket resting neatly on top. Nothing more than what was needed, nothing extra, and Ayanna stood near the door, not uncertain, not out of place, just present, her gaze moving slowly across the room, taking in each detail, not judging, not comparing, just seeing, and Caleb set the lantern down, its light steady, and he reached into a small cabinet, pulling out another piece of bread, placing it on the table without ceremony, and he poured water into a tin cup, setting it beside the bread, and he did not gesture toward it, did not offer it with words, because he understood that offering did not always require speech, and Ayanna moved then, stepping further into the room, her hand brushing lightly against the edge of the table, feeling the worn wood beneath her fingers, grounding herself in something tangible, something real, and she sat, not carefully, not cautiously, just naturally, as if the space had accepted her without needing permission, and Caleb remained standing for a moment, watching, not her, but the space itself, as if measuring how it had changed simply by her presence. And then he sat as well, across from her, the table between them not a barrier, but a shared place, and for a while, neither of them spoke, the quiet filled with the soft flicker of the lantern, the distant sound of wind moving across the land outside, and Ayanna reached for the bread, breaking off a small piece, not taking more than she needed, and she ate slowly, not out of hunger, but out of habit, the kind that came from understanding that what you had in front of you might not always be there tomorrow. And Caleb watched her for a moment, then looked down at his hand, the silver still resting in his palm, and he turned it slightly, the light catching its surface, and something about it felt different here, not because it had changed, but because its meaning had, and he placed it on the table between them, not offering it, not returning it, just setting it there, letting it exist in the space they now shared. And Ayanna's eyes moved to it, not immediately, not with urgency, but eventually, and she studied it for a moment, her gaze steady, and then she reached out, not to take it, but to touch it lightly, her fingers brushing its surface, and she said quietly, "It was never broken." And Caleb looked at her, his brow shifting slightly, not in confusion, but in curiosity that he did not voice, and she continued, her voice calm, "It only looks that way to those who do not know where it belongs." And the words settled into the room, not heavy, not light, just present, and Caleb leaned back slightly, considering that, letting it find its place alongside everything else that had unfolded since the town, and after a moment, he said, "And where does it belong?" And she looked at him, not directly at first, but at the space between them, at the table, at the small piece of silver resting there. And then she met his gaze, her eyes steady, and she said, "With the one who understands what it carries." And the answer did not explain, did not define, but it did not need to, because something in the way she said it made it clear that understanding was not something given, it was something chosen, and the silence returned again, but it was no longer empty. It was full, holding everything that had been said and everything that had not. And after a while, Ayanna stood, moving toward the small window, looking out into the night, and Caleb remained where he was, his gaze following her movement, not out of watchfulness, but out of presence, and she spoke again, her voice softer now, almost reflective. "This place." She paused, not searching for words, but allowing them to come. It does not ask anything. And Caleb nodded slightly, understanding what she meant without needing her to say more, and he replied, "That is why it works." And she turned back toward him, a faint shift in her expression, something that held both acknowledgement and something else, something quieter, and she said, "Most places do not allow you to stay unless you become something else." And Caleb met her gaze, steady, and he answered, "Then we will not let this one become that." And the words were simple, but they carried weight, not as a promise, not as a declaration, but as a choice. And Ayanna held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded, not agreeing, not accepting, but recognizing that something had been set in motion, something that did not need to be named to be real. And as the lantern flickered gently between them, casting soft shadows across the room, the cabin no longer felt like a place that had been empty. It felt like a place that had begun, quietly, without announcement, without demand, just by the presence of two people who had chosen, in their own way, to remain. Morning did not arrive with noise. It came slowly, light slipping through the edges of the window like something careful not to disturb what had settled during the night. And Caleb Thorne was already awake when it reached the table, the silver still resting where he had left it, catching the first pale glow as if it had been waiting for this moment to be seen differently again. And he sat there for a while, without moving, his hands resting flat against the wood, feeling the grain beneath his palms, grounding himself in the quiet before anything else began. And across the room, Ayanna stood near the window, not looking out this time, but standing still as if she had been there long before the light arrived, her posture calm, her presence steady, and for a moment, it was difficult to tell whether she had slept at all, or if sleep had even been something she allowed herself. And neither of them spoke, because the morning did not ask for words, it simply offered itself. And Caleb reached for the canteen, taking a slow drink, then setting it back down with care, and he glanced toward her, not to interrupt, not to ask, just to acknowledge, and she turned slightly, meeting his gaze without hesitation, and there was something new there, not unfamiliar, but clearer, like whatever distance had once existed between them had thinned without either of them needing to cross it. And she walked toward the table, her steps quiet, deliberate, and she sat again in the same place as before, not claiming it, not testing it, just returning, and her eyes moved to the silver, resting between them, and she studied it for a moment, then looked up at him, and she said, "It changes in the light." And Caleb followed her gaze, nodding once, because he saw it too, not in the object itself, but in the way it felt, the way its weight shifted depending on where it was held. And he said, "Most things do." And she tilted her head slightly, considering that. And then she reached out, this time picking it up, turning it in her fingers, the broken edge catching the light in a way that made it seem less like damage and more like shape. And she said, "It was given to someone who did not keep it." And Caleb leaned back slightly, not questioning the statement, but listening to it, letting it settle, and she continued, "It found its way back." And her voice did not carry judgment, did not carry blame, it simply carried truth, the kind that did not need explanation. And Caleb looked at her, his expression steady, and he said, "Maybe it was waiting for the right hands." And she met his gaze, and for a brief moment, something softened in her expression, not enough to change it, but enough to be seen. And she placed the silver back on the table, not pushing it toward him, not keeping it for herself, just letting it remain where it had been. And the space between them felt different again, not empty, not full. Something balanced, something that did not lean in either direction. And outside, the wind picked up slightly, brushing against the walls of the cabin, carrying the scent of the land with it. And Ayanna turned her head toward the sound, her attention shifting naturally. And Caleb followed her gaze, and he said, "This place holds steady, but the land around it does not." And she nodded once, her eyes still on the window, and she said, "Nothing does." And there was no sadness in her voice, no longing, just acceptance, the kind that came from understanding that stillness was never permanent, only temporary. And after a moment, she stood, moving toward the door, and Caleb watched her, not stopping her, not asking where she was going, because he understood now that movement did not always mean leaving. And she opened the door, stepping out into the morning light, and he followed after a moment, the air outside cooler than before, carrying the freshness of a new day, and the land stretched out the same as it had the night before, but it felt different, not because it had changed, but because they had, and Ayanna stepped forward a few feet from the cabin, her gaze scanning the horizon, not searching, not wary, just aware, and Caleb stood beside her, not close, not distant, just present, and for a while, they remained there, the silence returning again, but it was not the same silence as before. This one carried familiarity, like something that had begun to take root without needing to be named, and after some time, Ayanna spoke, her voice steady. "They will not return today," and Caleb nodded, not asking how she knew, because he had learned enough to trust what did not need to be explained, and he said, "Then today is ours," and the words were simple, but they held weight, not as a claim, not as a promise, but as recognition of something that had been given without being asked for, and Ayanna looked at him, her expression thoughtful, and she said, "You speak like you understand time," and Caleb let out a small breath, almost a smile, and he answered, "I understand what I do with it," and she considered that, then nodded once, and they stood there a while longer, the morning stretching around them, the cabin behind them no longer just a place, but something that held meaning now, something that had been shaped not by what it contained, but by who had chosen to remain within it. And as the sun rose higher, casting light across the land, the silver resting inside on the table caught that light once more, unseen by either of them, but present, waiting, not to be claimed, not to be returned, but to become something else entirely, something that neither of them had yet named, but both of them had already begun to understand. The sun climbed higher, but the day did not rush. It stretched, slow and deliberate, like it was giving them time to understand something that could not be learned in a single moment, and Caleb Thorne moved along the side of the cabin, checking the fence line out of habit more than necessity, his hands brushing against wood that had stood longer than most men stayed in one place, and behind him, Ayanna walked the edge of the open land, not pacing, not wandering, just tracing a line that only she seemed to see, her steps light but certain, and there was a rhythm to it, something that matched the wind, the distance, the quiet, and Caleb noticed it without staring, the way she did not walk like someone who had arrived somewhere new, but like someone who was learning how to stand still in a place that did not try to change her. And after a while, he returned to the front of the cabin, pausing at the doorway, his eyes drifting inside to the table where the silver still rested, catching light in a way that made it seem almost out of place in something so simple, and he stepped in, not to take it, not yet, but to look at it again, as if the longer he left it untouched, the more it would reveal something on its own. And outside, Ayanna stopped, her gaze lifting slightly toward the far stretch of land beyond the low hills, and something in her posture shifted, not alarm, not fear, but attention, and she stood there a moment longer before turning back toward the cabin, her steps quicker now, not rushed, but intentional, and when she reached the doorway, she did not speak right away, she simply stood there, watching Caleb as he stood near the table, the silver between them again. And then she said, quietly, "Someone is coming." And Caleb did not reach for anything, did not change his stance, he only turned his head slightly toward the open door, listening, not for sound, but for the absence of it, the way the wind adjusted, the way the space beyond the cabin seemed to tighten just enough to be noticed, and he stepped outside, moving beside her, his eyes following the direction of her gaze, and at first, there was nothing, just distance, just light, but then, far off, a faint movement appeared, small, almost nothing against the wide stretch of land, but steady, and Caleb narrowed his eyes slightly, watching, not with suspicion, but with awareness, and he said, "One rider," and Ayanna nodded once, her expression unchanged, and they stood there together, not stepping forward, not retreating, just waiting, and time stretched again, not empty, but full, and the rider grew clearer with each passing moment, not rushing, not cautious, just moving with purpose, and when the distance closed enough for shape to form, Caleb recognized the posture before the face, the way the rider held himself, upright, deliberate, like someone who carried more than just his own presence, and when the man finally drew close enough to be seen clearly, he slowed his horse several yards from the cabin, not approaching further, not forcing the space between them, and he dismounted slowly, his movements measured, and Caleb remained where he was, his stance unchanged, and Ayanna stepped slightly forward, not in front of him, not behind him, just beside him, and the man looked at her first, not surprised, not uncertain, just seeing, and then his gaze shifted to Caleb, steady, assessing, but without challenge, and for a moment, none of them spoke, the silence stretching between three people who did not yet share the same understanding. And then the man reached into his coat, pulling out something small, something wrapped in cloth, and he held it in his hand, not raising it, not offering it yet, just letting it be seen, and he said, his voice calm, I was told to bring this, and he extended his hand slightly, not toward Caleb, not toward Ayanna, just forward, leaving the choice of who would receive it unanswered, and Ayanna took a small step closer, her eyes fixed on the cloth, and she reached out, taking it without hesitation, and when she unfolded it, the movement was careful, deliberate, and inside, another piece of silver rested, not broken, not worn, but whole, its surface catching the sunlight in a way that made it seem almost unfamiliar compared to the one resting on the table inside, and she held it for a moment, her expression unreadable, and then she looked at the man, and he said nothing more, because whatever message had been carried had already been delivered, and after a moment, he stepped back, turning toward his horse, and without waiting for response, he mounted again, and rode away the same way he had come, steady, without urgency, without looking back, and Caleb watched him go, then looked at Ayanna, who still held the silver in her hand, and he said quietly, "They do not leave things unfinished," and she did not answer right away, her gaze still on the object, and then she spoke, her voice softer now, "No," and she closed her fingers around it, and when she turned toward the cabin, stepping back inside, Caleb followed, and the two pieces of silver now existed in the same space, one broken, one whole, resting under the same light, and the silence that filled the room felt different again, not uncertain, not waiting, but shifting, like something that had once been divided was now asking to be understood as one, and Caleb stood there, looking at both pieces, and he realized that whatever this was, whatever had begun the moment he chose not to walk away, it had not ended, it had only just begun to show its shape. The two pieces of silver rested on the table as if they had always belonged together, one catching the light clean and unbroken, the other holding it differently, scattering it along its uneven edge, and Caleb Thorne stood there for a long moment without touching either of them, his gaze moving between the two not in comparison, but in recognition of something he had not yet put into words, and across from him, Ayanna did the same, her hand still loosely closed from where she had held the newly arrived piece, as if she could still feel its weight even after setting it down, and the room remained quiet, not empty, but full in a way that made every small movement carry more meaning than usual. And after a while, Caleb reached forward, not for the whole piece, not for the broken one, but for both, his fingers resting lightly on each at the same time, and he slid them closer together, not forcing them to align, just bringing them into the same space, and the edges did not fit, not perfectly, not cleanly, but there was a suggestion there, a shape that almost completed itself without quite doing so, and he let his hand rest there for a second, then pulled it back, and he said quietly, "They were never meant to match." And Ayanna looked at the pieces, her eyes steady, and she shook her head slightly, not disagreeing, but refining, and she said, "They were never meant to be the same." And the distinction settled between them, subtle but clear, and Caleb leaned back slightly, considering that, letting the words shape the understanding forming in his mind, and outside, the wind shifted again, brushing softly against the cabin walls, carrying with it the sense that something beyond this place had already begun to move, even if they could not yet see it, and Ayanna reached out then, her fingers moving toward the unbroken piece, and she lifted it, holding it up to the light, turning it slowly, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something in her expression that had not been there before, not doubt, not uncertainty, something closer to memory, and she spoke, her voice softer now, almost distant. This was meant to be given, and Caleb watched her, not interrupting, not questioning, and she continued, not kept, and she lowered the piece slightly, her gaze shifting to the broken one still resting on the table, and she said, "That one was not given, it was taken away." And the words carried no anger, no blame, just truth, the kind that did not need to be defended. And Caleb looked down at the broken piece, his eyes tracing its edge, and he said, "And now they are both here." And Ayanna nodded once, slowly, and she placed the whole piece back on the table, not beside the broken one, but just slightly apart, leaving space between them, and she said, "That means something is not finished." And Caleb let out a quiet breath, not heavy, not strained, just enough to mark the moment. And he said, "Or something has just started." And she looked at him then, directly, and there was something in her gaze now that had not been there before, something that acknowledged not just his presence, but his place in what was unfolding. And she stepped closer to the table, her hand hovering briefly over the two pieces before she made a decision. And instead of taking either one, she pushed both of them gently toward him, not offering, not returning, just placing them within his reach. And she said, "You are the one who brought them together." And Caleb's brow shifted slightly, not in confusion, but in the weight of what she was placing in front of him. And he did not reach for them immediately. He let them sit there, let the meaning settle before deciding what to do with it. And after a moment, he picked up the broken piece first, holding it in his hand the way he had before, familiar, grounded. And then he picked up the whole piece, his fingers adjusting slightly to accommodate its smoothness, its completeness. And he held both at the same time, feeling the difference between them, not as contrast, but as connection. And he said quietly, "I did not bring them together." And Ayanna tilted her head slightly, watching him. And he continued, "I just did not walk away when I could have." And the words carried no pride, no weight beyond their truth. And she nodded once, understanding, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that had been said and everything that had not. And outside, the light shifted slightly, the sun moving across the sky, marking time in a way that felt both slow and certain. And after a while, Ayanna turned toward the door again, her gaze moving beyond the cabin, beyond the land immediately around them. And she said, "They will come again." And Caleb did not ask who, did not ask when. He simply nodded, because he understood now that some things did not need to be explained to be expected. And he placed both pieces of silver back on the table, this time closer together than before, not touching, but near enough to suggest that distance between them was no longer what it had been. And as he looked at them, he realized that, whatever this was, whatever it meant, it was not something that could be resolved by choosing one over the other. It was something that required both, something that only made sense when seen together. And he turned toward the door, stepping out into the light beside Ayanna. And as they stood there, the land stretching out before them, quiet, open, waiting, he understood that the next step would not be about holding on to what had been given, but about deciding what it meant to carry it forward. The wind carried farther that afternoon, not stronger, not louder, but farther, stretching across the land like something searching for where to settle. And Caleb Thorne stood just outside the cabin, his eyes following the horizon, not because he expected to see anything, but because he had begun to understand that waiting did not always mean looking for something specific. Sometimes it meant being ready for what arrived without warning. And beside him, Ayanna stood with the same stillness she had carried since the night before, but it was no longer the stillness of someone deciding where she belonged. It was the stillness of someone who had already chosen, and the land seemed to recognize that, the way the air moved around them, the way the silence no longer pressed but rested. And after a while, she spoke, her voice low, steady. "They will not come as before." And Caleb turned his head slightly toward her, not questioning, just listening. And she continued, "Not as watchers." And the words carried weight, not as warning, but as clarity. And Caleb nodded once, letting that settle. And he said, "Then they will come with purpose." And she looked at him, and for a brief moment, there was something in her gaze that acknowledged how quickly he had learned to read what was not spoken. And she gave a small nod, not agreement, not correction, just recognition. And the quiet returned. But it was not empty. It was full of anticipation, not the kind that tightened the chest, but the kind that widened it, preparing for something that would not be rushed. And Caleb turned back toward the cabin, stepping inside, and his eyes moved immediately to the table where the two pieces of silver rested, closer now than before, not touching, but no longer separate in the way they had been, and he walked toward them, his steps unhurried, and he reached out, picking them up again, one in each hand, feeling their weight, their difference, their connection, and for a moment, he held them apart, not comparing, not measuring, just acknowledging, and then he brought them closer, not to fit them together, but to understand how they moved in relation to each other, and something about it felt clearer now, not resolved, but understood, and he closed his fingers around, both, holding them together in his palm, and when he stepped back outside, Ayanna turned toward him, her eyes moving briefly to his hand, and she said nothing, because she did not need to, and Caleb walked a few steps away from the cabin, stopping at a spot where the ground was firm and undisturbed, and he knelt, not hurried, not ceremonial, just deliberate, and he placed the two pieces of silver on the ground, side by side, not hidden, not buried, just resting there in the open, and Ayanna watched him, her expression unchanged, but her presence focused, and when he stood again, he did not step back immediately, he remained there for a moment, looking down at them, and he said quietly, "They are not meant to be carried." And Ayanna stepped closer then, her gaze moving from him to the pieces on the ground, and she said, "No." And after a brief pause, "They are meant to be left where they can be found." And the words settled into the space between them, not heavy, not light, just true. And Caleb nodded, understanding that what he had done was not an ending, it was an opening, and the wind moved again, brushing across the ground where the silver lay, not shifting it, not disturbing it, just passing over, acknowledging. And they stood there together, not guarding, not claiming, just present. And after a while, the sound came, faint at first, almost lost in the movement of the air, but steady, growing clearer with each passing second, and Caleb did not turn immediately. He did not reach for anything. He simply listened, and Ayanna did the same, her posture steady, her gaze forward, and when the sound became distinct enough to recognize, the rhythm of hooves against the earth, not rushed, not hidden, just approaching, Caleb turned slightly, his eyes finding the source. Without urgency, and in the distance, multiple riders appeared, not scattered, not disorganized, but moving as one, their presence clear even before their forms became distinct, and Caleb felt no tightening in his chest, no instinct to step forward or back, only a quiet awareness that what had been set in motion was now arriving. And beside him, Ayanna did not move, did not shift, she simply stood, grounded, as if the land beneath her feet was holding her in place, and the riders drew closer, their pace steady, their line unbroken, and as they approached the edge of the space surrounding the cabin, they slowed, not stopping abruptly, not hesitating, just adjusting, and one by one, they dismounted, their movements calm, deliberate, and no one spoke, not yet, because the moment did not belong to words, it belonged to presence, and Caleb remained where he was, his hands empty now, his stance open, and Ayanna stepped forward, just slightly, not leaving his side, but not standing behind him either, and the space between them and the arriving group held something that had been building since the first coin hit the table in that distant town, something that had grown through silence, through choice, through understanding, and now it stood there, not demanding resolution, not asking for explanation, just existing, waiting for what would come next. And Caleb looked down once more at the two pieces of silver resting on the ground between them, and he understood then that whatever happened now would not change what they meant, because they were no longer objects, they were a decision, and that decision had already been made. No one reached for the silver, and that was the first thing Caleb Thorne noticed, not the number of riders, not the way they had arrived together without raising dust or sound, but the space they left untouched between themselves and what lay on the ground. Because out here, what a man chose not to touch said more than what he claimed, and the figures stood in a loose line, not forming a wall, not closing in, just present, their eyes moving between Ayanna, Caleb, and the two pieces of silver, resting where they had been placed, and the wind passed through them all the same, carrying no sides, no judgment, just air moving across land that belonged to none of them and all of them at once. And Ayanna stepped forward first, not far, just enough to mark that she was part of what was happening, not separate from it. And her voice carried across the space, calm, steady, spoken in the same language she had used before. But this time it held something final, something that did not ask, did not explain, just stated. And the men listened, not interrupting, not reacting. And when she finished, the silence that followed was not empty. It was complete, like a circle closing without needing to be seen. And the man who had stood at the ridge the night before stepped forward again. The same steady presence, the same measured movement. And he looked at Ayanna first, not questioning, not correcting, just seeing. And then his gaze moved to Caleb, and there was no challenge in it, no test, only recognition of a man who had remained where he could have left, and for a moment, that was enough. And he spoke then, his voice low, carrying across the distance without force. And though Caleb did not understand the words, he understood the tone, not judgment, not demand, something closer to acceptance. And Ayanna listened, her expression unchanged. And when the man finished, she did not answer right away. She looked down instead, at the silver resting between them all, and then she stepped forward, closing the last few feet of distance. And she knelt, not hurried, not ceremonial, just deliberate. And she picked up the broken piece first, holding it in her hand the way she had before. And then she picked up the whole piece. And for a moment, she held both, one in each hand, and the space around her seemed to quiet even further, as if the land itself was listening. And then she did something no one expected. Not Caleb, not the men watching. She placed the whole piece into Caleb's hand, closing his fingers around it the same way she had done before with the broken one. Firm, certain, and she kept the broken piece in her own hand. And when she stood, she did not step back. She remained where she was, between both sides, and she spoke again, her voice steady, carrying both languages now, the one Caleb did not understand and the one he did. What is given must be carried forward. And she looked at Caleb when she said the last words, not asking, not pleading, just seeing if he understood. And Caleb felt the weight of the silver in his hand, different from before, not just an object now, but something placed there with intention, and he did not look down at it. He kept his eyes on her, and he nodded once, because understanding did not always need to be spoken. And the man across from them watched this without interruption, without reaction, and then, slowly, he inclined his head, not to Caleb, not to Ayanna alone, but to the space between them, to what had been decided without needing agreement, and one by one, the others behind him mirrored that motion, not submission, not defeat, just acknowledgement. And then, just as they had arrived, they began to step back, not turning away immediately, not breaking the moment too quickly, but easing out of it, like something being set down carefully rather than dropped. And soon, the line of riders was no longer a line, just figures returning to distance, to movement, to the open land that had brought them there in the first place. And the sound of hooves returned, soft at first, then fading, until it became part of the wind again, and the space in front of the cabin was empty once more. But not the same kind of empty as before. This one held something. Something that had been placed there and would remain even after the people had gone. And Ayanna stood beside Caleb now, not in front of him, not behind him, just beside him, and she looked out at the land for a moment before speaking, her voice quiet, almost reflective. They did not come to take me back. And Caleb nodded, his gaze still forward, and he said, no. And after a brief pause, they came to see where you chose to stand. And she turned her head slightly toward him, and there was something in her expression now that had not been there before, not distance, not guardedness, something closer to peace. And she said, and you? And Caleb let out a slow breath, the kind that carried no weight, no tension, just presence. And he answered, I was already standing here. And that was enough. And the wind moved again, passing over the ground where the silver had been, where decisions had been made without words. And the cabin stood behind them, unchanged and yet no longer the same. And as the sun began its slow descent once more, casting long shadows across the land, Caleb shifted the silver slightly in his hand, feeling its weight, not as something he owned, but as something he had chosen to carry. And beside him, Ayanna opened her hand, the broken piece resting there, not incomplete, not lacking, just different. And together, without speaking, they turned toward the cabin, stepping back into the quiet that now belonged to both of them. And out here, where the land remembered everything but judged nothing, that was enough.